It was a bright and crisp morning when Chief Marcus Henderson, the black police officer, arrived at the precinct. As he walked through the front doors, he felt a sense of pride and responsibility that he had carried with him every day since taking on the role of police chief. Marcus had worked hard to earn the respect of his department and the community. He knew that being a black man in a position of authority in law enforcement came with its unique set of challenges, but he was determined to make a difference. Marcus had joined the police force many years ago with the dream of bringing about positive change. He had always believed in fairness, justice, and equality. And now, as chief, he was in a position to lead with those values. He wanted to set an example for the officers under his command, encouraging them to build trust with the community and to operate with integrity in every situation. But not everyone in the department shared his vision. There were still some old-school officers, like Officer Jake Carter, who believed in the traditional, outdated ways of policing. Jake had been with the force for over 20 years. He had a reputation for being tough, quick to anger, and openly skeptical of changes within the department. Over the years, Jake had been known to express his feelings about race and the direction Marcus was trying to lead the department. He wasn't shy about it. Despite the diversity of the force, Jake's views on authority and race were difficult to ignore. Jake didn't hide his disdain for Marcus. Whenever the two crossed paths, there was an invisible tension that always seemed to hang in the air. For Marcus, this was a painful reality. He had hoped that over time, Jake would come to understand that change wasn't about weakening the police force. It was about making it stronger, more effective, and more in tune with the needs of the community. But Jake was stubborn, and despite Marcus' best efforts to mentor and guide him, things had never improved between them. It wasn't just the officers whom Marcus had to worry about. As the first black police chief in the city, Marcus was under constant scrutiny. His every move was being watched, not just by the media, but by the community. People had high expectations, and in some cases, they were skeptical. They wanted to see change, but they also wanted to see that he could handle the pressures of leadership. Many questioned if he was capable of maintaining the balance between reform and discipline. The pressure was real, but Marcus knew that he was where he was supposed to be. He had earned it. Every day, he worked hard to prove himself, not just to his department, but to the people who depended on the police to protect and serve with fairness. But today, there was something in the air that felt different. As Marcus passed through the precinct and began his rounds, the weight of the day seemed heavier than usual. He didn't know it yet, but today would be the day that would test him in ways he never imagined. The morning had started like any other, but what Marcus didn't realize was that tensions had been building, not just in the department, but within his own team. Officer Jake Carter had been stewing in his own frustrations for some time, and something in him had snapped. Today, everything would come to a head, and it would change the department and Marcus forever. This was more than just a job for Marcus. It was a mission, a calling. But in this moment, he was unaware that it would soon be tested in the most shocking and emotional way. His leadership, his resilience, and everything he stood for would be pushed to the limits. As the morning wore on, Chief Marcus Henderson was busy with the usual responsibilities of running a police department. He held meetings with officers, reviewed reports, and discussed strategies for improving relations with the community. The city had been facing challenges recently, and Marcus was determined to steer his team through difficult times. The work was exhausting, but it was what he was passionate about. He knew that his leadership could make a real difference. In the midst of his busy day, Marcus was called to the briefing room for an unexpected situation. Officer Jake Carter had been involved in an incident, and the report was urgent. Marcus sighed, knowing that his troubled relationship with Jake had led to a number of difficult moments in the past. Jake had been a part of the department for over 2 decades, but despite his years of service, he had never quite adjusted to the changes Marcus was trying to implement. The tension between them had only grown in recent months, and Marcus had hoped things would improve. But now, as he walked toward the briefing room, He could sense that this situation was unlike any other. When Marcus arrived, he was greeted by a few officers standing in the corner, looking uneasy. They exchanged glances, avoiding eye contact with him as he entered the room. Jake was at the center of the room, visibly agitated, his hands clenched at his sides. He wasn't talking, but there was a sense of defiance in the way he stood. The air felt thick with discomfort. Marcus took a deep breath, walking over to Jake slowly. He could see the officer was upset, but he wasn't sure what had caused it this time. Jake was known for his short temper, but he had always respected Marcus as the chief. At least, that's what Marcus had hoped. "Jake, what's going on?" Marcus asked calmly, trying to maintain control of the situation. Jake didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the ground, and for a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't speak at all. But then he raised his head, his face flushed with anger. "I can't do this anymore, Marcus," he said, his voice trembling. "You've got all these new ideas, these reforms, and you're making us weak. I can't just stand by and watch it happen." Marcus was taken aback. He had heard Jake voice his frustrations before, but this felt different. The intensity in his voice, the frustration that seemed to be boiling over, was something new. Marcus knew that these were dangerous waters, but he had to stay calm. "You're still part of this team, Jake," Marcus said softly, his voice steady. "We can't make progress unless we work together. This is about making us better, not weaker. We can't keep going down the same path. We have to change." Jake's eyes flashed with anger, and before Marcus could react, Jake suddenly took a step back, reaching for his gun. Marcus's heart raced, but he stayed where he was, refusing to let fear take control. The officers in the room gasped, their eyes widening in shock. For a long, tense moment, the room was frozen. The sound of a clock ticking was the only noise that filled the air. Jake's hand was trembling as it gripped the gun, and Marcus could see the conflict in his eyes. It was as if Jake knew what he was doing was wrong, but something deep inside him wouldn't let him stop. Marcus didn't move. He didn't raise his voice or make any sudden movements. Instead, he stared at Jake, trying to convey strength and calm. He knew that this moment could easily spiral out of control, but he also knew that he had to show leadership, especially in the face of such a dangerous situation. "Jake, put the gun down," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. There was a long pause, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire world had stopped. The tension in the room was unbearable, and Marcus's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. He had faced dangerous situations before, but never anything quite like this. He could see the internal battle happening within Jake, and he knew that the next few moments would determine everything. The room was still. Time seemed to stretch on as Chief Marcus Henderson stared at Officer Jake Carter, who was holding his gun, unsure of what to do next. Everyone in the room was frozen, unsure whether to move or speak. The officers watched in stunned silence, their faces pale with fear and disbelief. Marcus's heart was racing, but his mind remained clear. This wasn't just a moment of personal danger for him. It was a defining moment for his entire department. He had worked so hard to create a culture of trust and unity, but in this instant, it seemed all of that was crumbling. Still, Marcus knew he had to remain calm. He couldn't let fear or anger guide his actions. It was up to him to set an example. "Jake," Marcus said again, his voice soft yet firm. "I know you're upset, but pointing that gun at me isn't going to solve anything." Jake's hand shook slightly, the weight of his gun almost too much for him to handle. His eyes were wide, filled with conflict. For a moment, it seemed like he might lower the weapon. But then, his face twisted with frustration. "You don't understand, Marcus. You've turned this department into something it wasn't meant to be. You've let people who don't belong here into positions they shouldn't have. And now the whole thing is falling apart." Marcus took a step forward, slowly and deliberately. He had to make Jake see reason, but he couldn't afford to make any sudden moves that might escalate the situation further. His voice remained steady, even though his mind was racing. "Jake, we're all here to serve and protect. That's the job we took on. And the world is changing. We can't just stay stuck in the past, doing things the way we always have. I'm trying to make things better. I'm trying to create a team that serves everyone equally. But we can't do that if we let things like fear, anger, and hate control us." There was a moment of silence as Jake looked at Marcus. His face was filled with a mix of emotions: anger, confusion, and perhaps a hint of regret. The gun was still in his hand, but the grip seemed to loosen slightly. It was a small victory, but Marcus knew that every second counted. The officers in the room watched, waiting for a sign of what would happen next. They had never seen Jake act like this before. He had always been known for his tough demeanor, but this was different. This was a moment of reckoning, a moment where Jake had to confront not just Marcus, but his own beliefs. "Jake," Marcus said, his voice gentler now, "I'm not your enemy. You know that. I've never been your enemy. But what you're doing right now is tearing us apart. You're better than this. We're better than this." Jake's expression shifted. The anger in his eyes began to soften, replaced by uncertainty. He glanced down at the gun in his hand, as if seeing it for the first time. His breathing was heavy, and the tension in the room was thick. Slowly, the weight of the moment seemed to hit him. He seemed to realize what he was about to do, and the consequences that would follow. For a brief moment, Jake stood completely still, his face a mask of inner turmoil. The gun remained in his hand, but his grip weakened. He turned his head slightly, as if seeking guidance from the other officers in the room. No one dared to speak, but the looks on their faces were full of empathy and concern. Finally, Jake's hand dropped. The gun fell to his side, and he let out a long, shaky breath. The tension in the room eased slightly, but no one moved yet. The moment had passed, but it was clear that things could never go back to the way they were before. Jake had made a choice, one that wasn't easy for him, and one that would haunt him for a long time. Marcus watched Jake, his heart still pounding in his chest. He didn't say anything at first. There was nothing more to say. But he knew, deep down, that this was the beginning of a long and difficult journey for Jake, and for their department as a whole. The road to healing and understanding wouldn't be quick, and it wouldn't be easy. But it had to start somewhere. "Let's get through this together, Jake," Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with both authority and compassion. "We're a team, and I'm not giving up on you." The room was still. The gun was on the floor, and the weight of the moment lingered. But for the first time in a long while, there was hope. The tense silence that followed felt like an eternity, but eventually Marcus could hear the soft sounds of the officers in the room exhaling collectively. The crisis had passed, but the emotional weight lingered. For the first time, Jake had lowered his weapon, but that didn't erase the gravity of what had just occurred. As the officers slowly relaxed, their expressions were a mix of relief, confusion, and uncertainty. They had just witnessed something no one could have predicted. Marcus stood still, watching Jake, unsure of what to do next. His mind raced, but he knew he needed to make sure the situation didn't spiral further. He needed to take control, not just for his safety, but for the well-being of everyone involved. This wasn't just about a personal altercation. This was about the integrity of the entire department and what it stood for. "Jake," Marcus said softly, his voice calm but firm, "I understand that you're frustrated. We all are. The changes I've been pushing for haven't been easy, but that doesn't justify what almost happened here today. We need to be better than this. I'm not giving up on you, but I need you to see what's at stake. This is bigger than just us." Jake didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his eyes focused on the floor, as if processing everything that had just unfolded. The anger that had been so evident in his expression earlier seemed to have faded, replaced by something else. Remorse, perhaps, or shame. It was hard to tell. But Marcus could see the conflict in Jake's eyes, the internal battle between what he had always known and the new reality that was unfolding before him. The room was quiet for a moment, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that allowed for reflection and understanding. Slowly, one of the other officers stepped forward, a young woman who had been with the department for only a few years. Her name was Officer Linda Rodriguez, and she had been one of the officers who had looked on in shock when Jake had drawn his gun. "I know this isn't easy, Marcus," Linda said, her voice hesitant but full of sincerity. "We all know there's been tension between Jake and you. But I think we all saw today that you're trying to make things better. This department needs change. And I think he's struggling to accept it." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know," he said quietly, "but change is hard, especially when it feels like you're losing control. Jake's been in this job a long time, and change is never easy for someone who's been doing things one way for so long. But that doesn't mean we can't try to make it work. We just have to be willing to do the hard work." Jake finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting Marcus's. There was something raw in his gaze, an acknowledgement of the truth that had been spoken, but also a hint of pride. Jake had never been the type to easily admit when he was wrong, but the events of the past few minutes had forced him to confront his own feelings and actions. "I'm sorry, Marcus," Jake said, his voice gruff, as if the words were difficult to push out. "I know I've been hard to deal with. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I don't know what came over me." Marcus didn't say anything at first. Instead, he gave Jake a long, steady look, one that conveyed understanding but also the seriousness of the situation. This wasn't the time for quick fixes or empty reassurances. The damage had been done, and it wasn't just about one officer's outburst. It was about the culture of the department, the values that had been put in place, and the long road ahead to rebuilding trust. "Apology accepted, Jake," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But you've got a lot of work to do. Not just to earn back my trust, but the trust of your fellow officers. We can't go backward from here. This department needs to move forward together." The officers in the room nodded in agreement. Marcus had spoken the truth. This wasn't just about one individual, it was about the entire team. They were all in this together, and if they wanted to rebuild the department and heal the divide, it would take effort from everyone. Jake looked around the room at his colleagues, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed to understand the weight of what was at stake. There would be no quick solutions, no easy fixes, but he knew that if he wanted to remain part of this team, he would have to prove himself, not just to Marcus, but to every officer in that room. It was a turning point, one that marked the beginning of a long, difficult journey for everyone involved. But in that moment, the first step had been taken, a step toward healing, understanding, and moving forward together. The days following the incident were filled with intense reflection and uncertainty. Chief Marcus Henderson knew that although Jake had lowered his gun and apologized, the damage wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The department had witnessed a breakdown in trust, and that could not be easily repaired. Marcus understood that his role as chief was to lead, not just in moments of crisis, but in moments of rebuilding. He had to ensure that the department didn't just move past this event, but learned from it and grew stronger as a result. An internal investigation was launched immediately after the incident. As the head of the department, Marcus took it upon himself to oversee the process. He knew that transparency and accountability were crucial, not just for the officers involved, but for the community that depended on them. Everyone needed to understand what had happened, why it had happened, and what would be done to ensure it never happened again. Officer Jake Carter was placed on administrative leave pending the results of the investigation. During this time, he had a lot of soul-searching to do. His colleagues were still processing what had unfolded, and some were still grappling with their own feelings about the situation. But Marcus also knew that Jake's actions couldn't be swept under the rug. They couldn't pretend that everything would be okay just because Jake had apologized. The community had seen the incident, and they deserved to know that action would be taken. While the investigation was ongoing, Marcus met with the officers individually. He wanted to know their thoughts, their concerns, and their feelings. He wasn't just looking for feedback about Jake's behavior. He was looking for insights into the department as a whole. He knew that there were underlying tensions, and this was the time to address them head-on. He had always been committed to creating a department based on fairness, respect, and trust, but he realized that there was still much work to be done. One afternoon, Marcus called Officer Linda Rodriguez into his office. Linda had been one of the first officers to speak out after the incident. She was younger than most of the other officers, and she had always been eager to bring fresh ideas to the department. Marcus appreciated her honesty, and he wanted to hear what she thought about how they could move forward. "Linda," Marcus began, "you've been here for a few years now. How do you feel about the changes that have been made? Do you think the department is heading in the right direction?" Linda took a deep breath before answering. "I think we're trying, Marcus, but there's still a lot of resistance. I see it in the way some of the older officers interact with the new recruits. There's a divide, and I think it's been there for a while. The changes you're pushing for are important, but I don't know if everyone is on board. And that scares me." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. He had known there was resistance to change, but hearing it from one of his own officers made the reality more tangible. "I understand," he said, "and I know it's hard. Change is never easy, especially when it feels like everything you've known is being turned upside down. But we have to keep moving forward. I need your help, Linda. You're part of this next generation of officers, and you have a voice. I need you to be part of the solution." Linda smiled faintly, appreciating Marcus's trust in her. "I'm with you, Chief. I know it's not going to be easy, but I want to see this department grow. I want to see us be better. And I know that starts with us, each and every one of us doing our part." Marcus felt a sense of hope. While the situation with Jake was serious, it had also opened the door for much-needed conversations within the department. Officers who had been hesitant to speak out before were now beginning to share their thoughts, and that was the first step toward healing. Marcus realized that leadership wasn't just about making decisions in moments of crisis. It was about guiding the department through the hard conversations, the uncomfortable moments, and the changes that were necessary for growth. As the investigation continued, Marcus made sure to keep the lines of communication open. He met with Jake several times, trying to help him understand the gravity of what had happened and the impact it had on the department. Jake was remorseful, but Marcus knew that real change would take time. It would take more than just apologies. It would take consistent actions, a commitment to personal growth, and a willingness to listen. The department's response to the situation was becoming clearer. Marcus had always believed in second chances, but he also believed in accountability. Jake would have the opportunity to prove himself, but only if he was truly willing to confront his actions and the biases that had led to that moment. The days turned into weeks, and the investigation into the incident involving Officer Jake Carter moved forward. Marcus kept himself busy, but the weight of what had happened never seemed to leave him. His focus was not just on the department's future, but also on Jake's future, as well as the larger question of how they could all move beyond the incident and rebuild the trust that had been shaken. It wasn't going to be easy, but Marcus had made a promise to himself and his team that he would do everything in his power to ensure that something positive came out of the experience. During this time, Marcus also met with the department's senior officers to discuss the path ahead. He knew that healing would require more than just talking about the issues. It would require action. The incident had exposed a deep divide between the old guard, like Jake, and the younger officers who were more open to change. While some officers were eager to move forward and embrace a more progressive vision, others were more resistant. Marcus knew that he couldn't change hearts and minds overnight, but he had to create a framework for change that everyone could follow. One afternoon, Marcus sat down with Jake again. This time, the conversation was different. Jake had been reflecting on his actions, and he was starting to see the full weight of what had happened. He knew that his outburst had been a moment of weakness, but he also knew that it was the result of years of internalized frustration, fear, and resentment. He had spent most of his career holding on to outdated beliefs, never really questioning them until now. "Marcus," Jake began, his voice quieter than it had been before, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I know I've let you down, and I'm sorry for that. But I think I finally understand why you're pushing for change. It's not just about politics or policies. It's about making this department better for everyone." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "It's not an easy road, Jake. I've been trying to create an environment where every officer feels valued and where we serve the community with respect and fairness. That can't happen if we're divided. We all have to work together. And that starts with you." Jake sat back, his eyes thoughtful. "I want to get it right, Marcus. I'd spent so many years doing things the way I've always known, and I realize now that wasn't enough. I want to change, but I'm not sure how to start. Can you help me?" Marcus could see the sincerity in Jake's eyes, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of hope. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was willing to help Jake make the changes he needed to make. After all, Marcus had always believed in second chances, but he also believed in accountability. "We'll start small," Marcus said. "There's no magic formula, no overnight solution, but we can begin by building trust, starting with yourself and your fellow officers. You'll need to show them, and yourself, that you're committed to change. It won't be perfect, but it will be progress." Over the next few weeks, Jake took part in various training sessions and counseling, all designed to help him confront the biases that had led to his actions. It wasn't easy for him, and there were moments of doubt, but he was determined to make things right. He started having more conversations with his colleagues, trying to understand their perspectives and their experiences. Slowly, the walls that he had built around himself began to crumble. Marcus watched this transformation closely. He knew that Jake was making progress, but he also knew that it would take time. Healing was not a quick fix. It was a long, steady process that required patience, introspection, and most importantly, action. But Marcus was committed to seeing it through. Meanwhile, the department itself was starting to heal as well. Officers who had been hesitant to speak out about their concerns were now sharing their thoughts openly. There was a sense of camaraderie developing between the older officers and the younger ones, and even though there were still challenges to face, there was a renewed sense of purpose within the department. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about serving the community and making sure that everyone, regardless of background or identity, was treated with respect. As time went on, the department began to see the positive effects of the changes Marcus had implemented. The officers who had once resisted change were beginning to embrace it. For Marcus, the journey wasn't over. He knew that there would always be challenges ahead, but the most important lesson he had learned was that leadership wasn't about making the right decisions all the time. It was about guiding people through difficult moments, supporting them when they fell short, and celebrating their successes when they took the right steps forward. In that sense, Marcus knew that he was doing the right thing. It wasn't perfect. As the weeks went by, the department began to settle into a new rhythm. The tension from the earlier incident slowly started to fade, but it was clear that things had been permanently changed. Chief Marcus Henderson had worked hard to ensure that every officer was supported, and while the wounds hadn't healed completely, there was progress. The trust that had been shattered was slowly being repaired, piece by piece, as everyone worked toward understanding each other better. But this wasn't a quick fix. Marcus knew it would take time, and he was ready for the challenge. Officer Jake Carter, once at the heart of the conflict, was still undergoing his own transformation. The counseling, the conversations with fellow officers, and the training were all part of his journey toward reconciliation. It wasn't easy for him. Every day, Jake had to confront the habits and thoughts that had defined his career for so long. He had to admit to himself that the beliefs he had once held weren't just flawed. They were wrong. But Jake was committed to change. There were still moments of doubt, But with each passing day, he could feel himself becoming a better officer, and more importantly, a better person. The officers around him noticed the change as well. They saw Jake making an effort to understand their perspectives, listening to their concerns, and genuinely working to connect with them. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, but it was enough for them to start believing in his commitment. They could see the sincerity in his actions. For the first time in a long time, the department felt like it was coming together, united by a shared goal, to serve the community with respect and fairness. Meanwhile, Marcus had made it his mission to ensure that everyone in the department felt heard. He continued to hold regular meetings with officers, offering them opportunities to voice their concerns, ideas, and frustrations. There was a new sense of openness that hadn't existed before. The walls that had once separated the officers, those who were open to change and those who resisted, were beginning to come down. Even the older officers, who had been skeptical about the changes Marcus was implementing, were starting to see the benefits. They were beginning to understand that the changes weren't meant to weaken the department, but to strengthen it. One afternoon, Marcus decided to hold a department-wide meeting. It had been a few months since the incident with Jake, and Marcus felt it was time for the team to come together and reflect on how far they had come. The meeting was held in the same briefing room where everything had started, and as the officers filed in, Marcus could sense the atmosphere was different. There was a quiet confidence in the room, a sense that they had moved beyond the crisis and were now focused on the future. As the officers took their seats, Marcus stood at the front of the room, looking around at the familiar faces. There were officers who had once doubted him, officers who had been skeptical of the changes he was pushing for, and officers who had stood by him through it all. Today, they all shared a common purpose. "We've been through a lot," Marcus began, his voice steady and strong. "We've faced challenges that none of us expected, but I'm proud of how far we've come. The road hasn't been easy, and there's still work to be done, but we're stronger because of it." There was a pause as the room filled with a quiet sense of agreement. The officers were listening, taking in Marcus's words. He could see that they were beginning to understand the importance of what had happened. It wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about the entire department and the way they worked together. "We've made a lot of progress, but we can't stop here. We have to continue working on building trust with each other and with the community. We have to keep moving forward, because if we stop, we risk going backward." There was a murmur of agreement from the officers. They understood. They knew that this wasn't just about keeping the peace. It was about creating a culture of respect, understanding, and collaboration. They had learned from their mistakes, and now they had the opportunity to build something better. Jake, sitting in the back of the room, was one of the first to speak after Marcus finished. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "I know I've made mistakes. I've let this department down, but I'm committed to changing. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm worthy of being part of this team." His words were met with nods of acknowledgement from the other officers. No one expected perfection, but they could see that Jake was genuine in his desire to make things right. The meeting ended on a hopeful note. There was still much work to be done, but the team was moving in the right direction. As the officers filed out of the room, Marcus felt a sense of pride. As the weeks passed, the changes within the department became more apparent. The atmosphere had shifted from one of tension and uncertainty to one of cooperation and shared purpose. While Marcus Henderson knew that the journey was far from over, he could feel a real sense of progress in the air. The department was beginning to understand that unity wasn't just about working together when things were easy. It was about staying strong during the difficult moments, facing challenges together, and growing as a team. Jake Carter, who had been at the center of the department's internal conflict, had made incredible strides in his personal journey. He continued to participate in training and counseling, and his efforts to connect with his colleagues and build trust were beginning to pay off. Though there were moments of doubt and struggle, Jake was determined to prove that he could change. He knew he had a long road ahead, but he wasn't giving up. The other officers noticed the difference in Jake. There was a subtle but significant shift in his behavior. He listened more, judged less, and was becoming more open to the ideas and perspectives of his fellow officers. Some were still cautious, unsure if this change was permanent, but many had started to support him, encouraged by the genuine effort they saw. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about seeing that Jake was willing to put in the work to become the officer he needed to be. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he was truly part of the team, not just as an officer, but as someone who was building trust and earning respect. The department's transformation wasn't just about the individuals involved. It was about the collective commitment to the values that Marcus had been trying to instill since the beginning: fairness, transparency, and respect. The officers were slowly learning that change didn't mean weakness, but strength. Change was necessary, not just for their growth as individuals, but for the community they served. One day, Marcus stood at the front of the department meeting room, his heart swelling with pride as he looked around at the officers seated before him. There was a feeling of optimism that he hadn't seen before, a quiet but powerful understanding that they were no longer divided. They were moving forward together. "I know this hasn't been easy," Marcus began, his voice carrying the weight of the past few months. "We've faced challenges that no one expected, but we've grown from them. Each one of you has played a part in that growth. And now we are in a place where we can look to the future with hope." The officers nodded, some exchanging glances with one another. They had been through a lot, but they had come out on the other side stronger. The unity they had begun to build wasn't something that could be broken easily. It had been earned through hard work, difficult conversations, and a willingness to change. "I want to thank all of you for your dedication and your willingness to be a part of this journey," Marcus continued. "It's not always easy to face the truth, to confront the mistakes we've made, but it's the only way we can grow. And we're growing. We're becoming the department that this community deserves." A sense of pride filled the room. It was a quiet pride, not born from arrogance, but from the knowledge that they had worked hard to reach this point. They had faced their flaws, their mistakes, and their differences, and they had found a way to move past them. This wasn't just about the chief or the officers. It was about the entire department coming together with a shared commitment to change. After the meeting, Marcus found himself standing alone for a moment, looking out the window of his office. He reflected on the journey, the struggles, the setbacks, and the small victories along the way. There had been times when he had doubted if they could truly make a difference, but now he felt confident that they were on the right path. Jake approached him quietly, standing just outside the door before stepping in. "Thank you, Marcus," he said, his voice sincere, "for not giving up on me. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying. I'm learning every day." Marcus smiled, a sense of gratitude filling his chest. "I never gave up on you, Jake. I believed in you even when you didn't believe in yourself." Jake nodded, a quiet sense of understanding between them. He knew that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but he also knew that he wasn't walking it alone. The department and Marcus were there with him every step of the way. As Marcus watched Jake leave his office, he felt a deep sense of hope for the future. There would always be work to do, always room for improvement, but the most important thing was that they had started. They had begun the hard work of change, and they were doing it together.